Tell us a little bit about the talk and how you decided on the theme of the presentation.
Yeah, absolutely. It's I think it's a huge honour to be invited to be an IATEFL plenary speaker, and so that gives you an enormous amount of potential to think about what to talk about and where to focus the talk on. What I wanted to do is kind of pull together three of the most important strands in my professional career, and I guess it's probably the most personal talk I've prepared. A lot of myself in terms of my own background and history, and why that's important to me to talk about integration of those three themes. Thinking about this, was in preparation for the IATEFL conference in Manchester, which we had to cancel due to the pandemic. But I think a lot of the themes were actually quite prescient in terms of the role of teachers, and teacher empowerment's one of my major concerns, and the role that teachers have had to play in really being at the center of a move to online learning, online teaching, and by extension, online assessment. And I think that's kind of been incredibly fast forwarded by the pandemic, and none but the most ardent educational technologists perhaps would have pushed us this far, this fast. But what it's meant is that in terms of our daily practice, the way we interact with our students and our colleagues, the way we look at how we teach and how our learners learn, and how we measure that learning, and how we recognize that learning, how we feed back on that learning, all of this is now mediated to a greater or lesser extent by educational technology or other technologies co-opted for an educational purpose. And so I think that in my career, I've been involved in educational technology for a long time. It's led to the founding of the Aqueduto organization. I've also been heavily involved in assessment. My master's degree was in language assessment at Lancaster University, and bringing those three themes together to look at what it means for teachers when we have to ask and answer the questions of how we should assess, how we should look at our teaching leading to assessment, how we should embed assessment within our teaching. Educational technology is now a central part of that. In some cases, I think potentially for better. In some cases, certainly for worse at the outset, while we adjust and while we make those crucial decisions about, firstly, do we test and assess it in traditional ways when there's so much upheaval in the teaching and learning process, and as we emerge from an online emergency response, do we hold on to certain aspects of teaching and learning asynchronously, synchronously online, and what does that mean for the way we measure students and what we do in terms of feeding back on their progress and supporting them in their language learning. So I'm trying to pull all those three strands together, very well aware that I'm biting off a huge set of categories within the language education sector. And my main focus will really be around the assessment part of that, because I think that's where I have the most to contribute, and the ideas that I think we should carry forward into the rest of this decade, and certainly the next 12 to 18 months.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, it does sound like there's going to be a lot in there, packing a lot into. It's an hour, no, the talk, I believe. Is that right?
Yeah, I think 50 minutes I'm planning for.
Okay. I mean, one of the interesting things, you sort of talk about testing and assessment there, and I think one of the key things, or one of the sort of the key themes that seems to emerge again and again when we've been doing Facebook Lives, or when we've been doing webinars, is around assessment, and how do we do that online, where you can't sort of keep an eye on the students, etc. So there's obviously a lot of concerns there for teachers, perhaps working in, or presumably working more in education systems where it's more of a summative assessment rather than formative assessment. And people are always asking for advice. Is your talk going to provide some of that advice, do you think, Tom?
I mean, I think it's really about asking and trying to answer some of the bigger questions. Every context is different, and so a particular practical piece of advice, while maybe useful for certain teachers in certain contexts, might not be applicable or possible for teachers in other contexts. And that's certainly something I've found in the last 15 months, doing a lot of presentations and webinars precisely with this aim, to try and support teachers who are are facing this challenge. But really, I think that there's a question about what we see as kind of quality within our role as teachers, because we have a lot of empowerment. I think the teacher has been placed in the center of this response to the pandemic in terms of the teaching and learning, and a huge adaptability and an innovation and creativity and learning amongst teachers to be able to adapt to their new reality of how their class is going to exist, and what they can bring in to support that, and how they can support their students while they're remote. But it's kind of a microcosm of the bigger problem in teacher education, that assessment is often seen as an add-on or an aside. If you look at a pre-service teaching course, assessment testing is given a small sliver of time, when really so much of what we do in the classroom is based on our informal assessment, and how we are looking at our students, and how we're deciding what to teach, and how we're deciding when to move on. So much of this is based on an aspect of assessment that I think it's really undervalued and underexplored in terms of what teachers can do in that space for themselves and for their students. But also, as you mentioned, we've got these pressures of external assessments, summative assessments, large-scale proficiency assessments, making life-changing decisions about what our students can do with the learning they've had in our classes. And so I think there's a lot of competing pressures within that. And so, if and where we can, we need teachers to feel confident about their options, and that they can make principled decisions about their assessment in the same way they'd make them about their teaching and their learners' learning.
Mm-hmm. Okay, interesting. Do you think, I mean, in terms of how teachers have adapted, obviously, your talk, I don't know when you were planning to do this talk, but do you feel that, I mean, we've been talking about the pandemic and obviously how that's had an influence on everything that we're doing within teaching. When you started thinking about this talk, was it sort of pre-pandemic, and has it changed, and if so, how has it changed what you're going to be talking about as a result of that?
Yeah, certainly the planning started pre-pandemic, and a lot of the initial thoughts and presentations and work and research I've been doing on these three areas, have been for much of my career. And I think it's that acceleration of exposure to the demands of online and technology mediated teaching and learning and assessment that's really brought this as an issue to many more people than perhaps would have considered it part of their remit or part of their responsibilities. And so there are very few teachers around the world now who haven't had to consider some of these issues, or haven't been responsible for making classroom decisions or institutional decisions or wider educational sector decisions. And so whereas before we may have been kind of tiptoeing through this and looking for emerging best practice and relying on the research and getting teacher education programs in place to support changes and implementation of technology, suddenly that fast forwarding, it's been nicely described by Ross Thorburn in a recent book as the future that became the present. And suddenly we've been thrown into this situation, and we're having to make very important decisions very quickly, without perhaps the level of development support, or without the level of knowledge of best practice that we'd like to have there. So those are the concerns that I'm trying to address in the kind of the reworked presentation, thinking through what I've seen in terms of teachers' contexts over the past 12, 15 months, the kind of questions they're asking, the kind of challenges they're facing, and a dose of realism as well. We're not all fantastic item writers. We're not all able to take a traditional assessment and put it into a digital format that we're comfortable with in terms of quality. And so where does that quality lie, and where does the teacher's responsibility for that quality need to come in, and how can we kind of embrace that so it's not an antithesis to the teaching, but it's part of what we do as our daily practice, and also our semester or termly practice.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, I guess that's, I mean, it's true, isn't it? It's an interesting quote, the future and the present. I think, obviously, as you say, normally you would have, the sort of slow process of development and best practice and teacher education, which kind of supports teachers in this way. And they've been largely very resilient and robust in sort of finding their way through things and making it work to a large extent. I just sort of wondered, do you feel, I mean, obviously you need to sort of separate perhaps teachers from education systems and those people who kind of run those education systems in certain countries or schools or institutions, academies, and so on. Do you feel there's, as a result of this, there's perhaps going to be a shift from, I guess a sort of more of a top-down approach where, education systems devise ways of teaching and methodologies and et cetera, and where you've got the teachers who are coping, who are managing, who are developing individual strategies. What do you see in terms of the future and with regard to teachers informing the education systems sort of from their own practice and that shaping how education, what education becomes? Sorry, it's quite a long question. I'm not even sure there is a question in there. I guess that sort of is the relationship between teachers and their sort of their bosses or the heads or the whatever. Do you think that will change, or things will change?
Yeah, we can but hope, Paul. I mean, I think one of the realizations that I think we've come to is that when the chips are down, it's the teachers who had to stand up and be counted. And as you say, huge resilience, huge adaptability. And I hope that's recognized and I hope that's rewarded, because it is that teacher at the heart of the educational process that makes changes that are grounded in this, a sensible and a principled and work for their learners. Educational systems are small c conservative in their nature. They're slow to change. It's turning a juggernaut, and once you start turning a juggernaut, you better be fairly sure that you're turning in the right direction. And there are some people who believe it doesn't really matter which way you turn, just give it time to be consolidated rather than innovation without consolidation. And I think what I hope we'll see is that there'll be lessons learned from the ground up, and that we'll see what has worked and what has been practically applicable, what innovation there has been from teachers in their classrooms and from single school settings, and that will feed upwards into educational systems. Because I think that teachers have this understanding of what works on a practical basis, and if we can feed in some of the what works on a principled theoretical basis as well, so we don't lose those concepts of the validity of assessment and the reliability of assessment, then we're going to get to, hopefully, a meeting of minds in the middle. That may seem utopian in people who know how education systems work and how school management works when it's divorced from the classroom practice, or how it's pushed and pulled by stakeholder requirements or parents' expectations or wider societal pressures. All of those things impact, but the way teachers have responded to the pandemic gives me great confidence that further empowerment of teachers to make these kind of decisions should be taken notice of, and I hope it will be the case. Of course, every context will be different. Every system will make different decisions based on how it wants to emerge from the pandemic and the extent to which it wants to hold on to some of the affordances we've seen from online digital remote delivery, and whether best practice is allowed to emerge from that, from teacher, hopefully practitioner research as well as practitioner anecdotal evidence. That can only be to the good from my perspective.
Okay, yeah, no, interesting. I think I've just seen a piece of research that Steve Mann is working on recently around, it's more around professional development and the idea of online professional development versus face-to-face. But in that, there's an interview with him actually that we've got on the Facebook page where he talks about what teachers prefer, whether they prefer face-to-face or online. And I think there's an obvious kind of sense that teachers prefer face-to-face to online in general, but that now they can sort of see that with the shift to online, that there are huge benefits of that, and obviously that kind of follows through with teaching. I was talking to a teacher yesterday who's gone back to face-to-face teaching, and she was saying that she actually preferred doing it online. So that's quite an interesting sort of shift, I think, as people have got more and more used to being online for their professional development, for teaching, but for everything largely.
I would agree with that. I think that the genie's out of the bottle. The exposure to online learning, online teaching, online teacher education has been so widespread in such a short period of time that at least teachers are talking from experience when they make those decisions now. And we often see the claims of kind of the anytime, anywhere possibilities of online education, but I think certainly in teacher education there are crucial aspects in terms of embedding that within their practice. So there's time for reflection, there's time for implementation of ideas, there's time for bringing those back, for co-constructed learning with other participants who are in similar or completely different contexts. And there's also that time for reflection, research, going off on tangents, doing your own independent research on topics that are of interest to you, that can happen over a longer period of time with more extensive online course that with the best will in the world, they don't happen in intensive face-to-face teacher education courses to the same extent. Of course, there are huge advantages to being in a face-to-face context and to being able to see, and the experiential learning of activities and approaches that you can try out when you're a trainee teacher or when you're in-service development courses. And there's also potentially the cultural and linguistic immersion aspect of courses that are hosted in different places. But I think people will make more experienced and principled decisions about what they take for their professional development opportunities and how they take them based on the experience over the last 12, 15 months.
Okay, thank you. Tom, we've just got one question. I think perhaps the audience hasn't managed to come over from Facebook, but we will obviously be putting a recording of this up on Facebook. There is a question from Karen. Okay, so I mean, you touched on this before, obviously, with the idea of assessment face-to-face or paper-based assessment and online, and the sort of expertise in being able to adapt that. So the question from Karen is there a difference in the design of online assessment compared to paper-based assessment? I'm assuming the answer is yes. I wondered if you could expand on that.
Yeah, I mean, lots of differences. I think there's one side of that spectrum of difference, which is the nature of language use online different to the nature of language use when we're face-to-face or when we're communicating in paper-based form? And I think the answer to that would certainly be yes, and that the experience that we've all had in terms of mediated or digitally mediated communication has shown that there's differences in the way we interact with each other. The whole idea of turn taking and interrupting and nominating and being part of a group discussion is very different, and the language we've used has evolved to take into this Zoom awareness, for want of a better term. So there's all that side of how is the language that we assess different when we're doing it online. But then there's the practicalities of what can we do digitally that we couldn't necessarily do on a pen and paper based test. Are there options for more multimedia and multimodal assessment? Can we give more choice in terms of learners' assessment tasks, because they can make real-time choices based on a range of options that we can offer online, rather than something that has to be prepared and photocopied and handed out in an invigilated room. There's also the aspect of what can we capture in terms of students' performance, and that's something I'm really interested in. The ephemeral nature of an oral assessment, for example, that would have happened in a room with an assessor or two assessors and candidates. Having that online, there's possibilities for recording, reviewing, for feedback, for students to see their own progress within that. Is our writing style different when we write online, and does that depend on the tool we use for that? And I don't know how you use your mobile phone for writing, Paul, but I kind of use a swipe keyboard, which is very different from a computer keyboard, and certainly very different from how I would write with a pen. So maybe that changes our thoughts. I think Nietzsche said back in the 1870s that the tool we use to write determines the thoughts we have when writing. He was talking about being given a typewriter for Christmas by his sister, but I think it holds true today. Do we change the way we respond, and does the nature of an online task force us to think differently about assessment. Is it more real time? Can we do it collaboratively? Can we break some of these traditional barriers to using digital resources, to collaborative learning, to working in teams, all of these things that we kind of count as 21st century skills and important life skills for the future, yet they're kind of anathema to a traditional testing process. So I think, that there are a huge number of new questions and exciting and interesting questions when we think about online assessment versus a traditional form. Of course, it's possible to take your pen and paper test and make a digital version of it, but why would we, when we've got this opportunity to push things forward a bit?
True. No, that's a good point. No, very interesting. Yeah, it does. Just swipe keyboards are still a bit beyond me. I sort of struggle. I sort of just get scared. But but things like where you're kind of typing, even with emails now, where you're sort of typing and it starts to suggest the end of the sentence for you and things like that.
The whole autofill thing. I'm sure we've all been on the end of some embarrassing mistakes for that. I was chatting via WhatsApp to my 11-year-old son, and his comment after about 4 exchanges is, "Why are you using full stops?" I was like, "Sorry," and he just replied "TY," which little meant for us, that means thank you, in his way of using language to communicate in our digital mediated communication. So language is changing alongside us. Are we changing as fast as we need to? Have we ever? I'm not sure. I think we're playing catch up a little bit, and I think particularly right now we're playing catch up with assessment because our focus has been, rightly so, on teaching and learning, but there are opportunities to push change in assessment as well, which I think will be really valuable and valid.
Great. Okay. Fantastic. Thanks, Tom. It's very interesting to talk for a lot longer about this, but we're gonna bring it to a close. So your talk at IATEFL is, as I said, integrating teaching, testing, and technology where angels fear to tread, and that's on Sunday, the 21st of June. So for anyone watching this recording, if you haven't registered yet for IATEFL, you can still do that, I believe, until Thursday this week, so you've got a couple of days still, possibly a little bit longer to do that.
I think I think it's the 20th of June, Paul.
20th of June, is it? Okay, thank you. Okay.
Definitely the Sunday, but if I turn up a day late because of what you've said, I'll be in trouble.
I'm just going on. Sorry. What did I say? Did I say the 21st?
21st. That's fine. Yeah.
Did I? Sorry, no. That's Sunday the 20th. So great. Tom, it's been great talking to you. Apologies for some of the technical issues that we had earlier on with Facebook, and we look forward to your talk. I shall certainly be attending, and looking forward to that. So great. Thanks ever so much for that.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks to everyone who managed to join us. Technical challenges are part of our new reality.
Exactly. Great. Thanks, Tom.
Okay. Take care. Bye-bye.
Right.